Welcome to Reclaiming Home, a podcast focused on delivering thoughtful conversation and tangible actions to make housing justice a reality in our communities. I'm your host, Asale Sol Young, Executive Director of Urban Homeworks, an educator, activist, and proud Turtle Papa. I'm a Black Legacy native of Evanston, Illinois, and a proud descendant of Haitians and rural Black and Indigenous North Carolinians. Join me as we take time each month to dive into all things housing, including potential policies, community dreams, persistent systemic barriers. We'll also celebrate success and everything in between. We are so glad you're here. Here at Urban Homeworks, we acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that European colonizers stole from the Dakota people indigenous to Minnesota. In order for this theft to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We also acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that was cultivated and developed by bodies that European colonizers stole from West African countries through the transatlantic slave trade. In order for these thefts to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, forced assimilation were employed. As we acknowledge what was taken from our collective human ancestors, we commit to work and fight for the liberation of the descendants of those enslaved through American chattel slavery and the sovereignty of all Native peoples. Welcome to Reclaiming Home, Housing Justice with Urban Homeworks. Today, I am joined by Charles Gardner, Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. Charles, would love it if you could kick off our introductions today by just sharing a little bit about yourself, how you ended up in the work that you do, and your preferred pronouns.
Sure. Well, thank you, Asal, and thank you very much for having me on for this conversation. I appreciate it. This is a great topic, and I'm excited to talk about it with you. I am currently a research fellow with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, pronouns he, him. And I've been there for about a year working with the urbanity team, where we focus on solutions to current housing problems, whether that's zoning issues, general land use issues, things like that, generally approaching them from a market perspective. And my background, though, is not as an economist, but as an attorney. I came to Mercatus Center after about 10 years in private practice and litigation. And through that, I became acquainted with some of the case law on land use and zoning, which has a history of almost maybe over 100 years, and developed an interest in that, in seeing how the courts had allowed many of these regulations to go through, despite there being some awareness, if you read some of the decisions, that there were some improper motives involved here. And fortunately, at Mercatus, I have a chance to explore those interests more, along with some colleagues who are really passionate about this type of work, and hope to promote some changes for the better going forward.
That's great. And we appreciate you doing that work because it's so necessary. As we're going to dig into today, really breaking down for the audience what zoning is, how it impacts us today, how it impacted our ancestors, and what we can do to get to a better place in housing and housing equity. As you all know, my name is Asale Sol. I'm the executive director here at Urban Homeworks. I prefer they, them pronouns. If you're newer to Urban Homeworks, we are a nearly 30-year-old organization. Our vision is housing justice for all. And so that is why we are here today. So Charles, I'd love to just start with a real grounding in basic education. What is zoning?
Great basic question that often we gloss over, right? Let me just say first, I'll be talking about American zoning, right? Because zoning does exist in many other countries, but it's usually in a form that's much different, and usually actually allows landowners more freedom in terms of what they can do with their land than in the United States. It's actually the subject of an interesting book from a few years back by Professor Sonia Hurt that I'd recommend to anybody interested in a comparative look, sort of stepping back to the international level to see how American zoning looks compared to other places in the world. But American zoning in its essence, right, I define it as the use of state-granted municipal power to divide up a jurisdiction, a county, town, a city, or to segregate a jurisdiction, I guess you could say, into separate areas. They're subject to separate rules for what you can lawfully build and what you can lawfully do on a property. I think in a nutshell, that's the essence, is dividing an area up subject to different rules for whatever reason that may be.
Great.
So, yeah, so fundamentally, I mean, just to detail that a little bit, flesh that out a little bit more. So zoning governs the physical form of buildings, right? We know that, like height, setbacks, floor area, how many parking spaces you need. It also covers use, which is, I think, what we maybe typically think about, industrial uses, residential uses. But it also, as you know, it creates fine distinctions even between types of residential by specifying how many living units somebody can put inside a building. And we give these all sorts of different labels: single-family house, a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, breaking these all down and calling them different uses, right? Even though they're all simply places where people live and call home. And it can sometimes regulate other things that don't quite fall into either category, like restricting occupancy of a living unit to families who are related by marriage or blood, and excluding groups of unrelated people. Something you very frequently see in zoning codes, particularly in areas where there are a lot of students, where you're trying to prevent people from just renting out individual rooms. So I think that's a broad way in which I would define it. Those are the common features you tend to see. There are 1,001 different forms, state by state, city by city. But those are some of the general characteristics, I think, that define it in the United States.
Yeah, appreciate that. And also always appreciate when folks bring in an international context, because in America, we definitely think the way we do it is the way everyone is doing it. So one of the reasons why this topic of zoning is important to us at Urban Homeworks is obviously because of the state legislation that's being worked on here. It's also being worked on a citywide level currently through the 2040 comprehensive plan, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the things that matters, like why zoning matters, is because of what has been evidenced as the case between zoning, restrictive zoning, and essentially racial segregation and the impact on the housing or home ownership gap. And so it is really important that as a city, the mayor created the 2040 plan to start to back up on some of these policies because of their impact. So the 2040 plan seeks to expand zones eligible for housing, allow highest density housing in and near downtown, allow multifamily housing and density on public transit routes, eliminate minimum off-street parking requirements on new development citywide, et cetera. So this is something that's really important and really effective, could be really effective. What we know is that there is a case against the 2040 plan that is slowing that down. And so before we get into that, recognizing that there's this history with zoning, can we actually just start with why was zoning created in the first place?
That is a fascinating question, and books have been written trying to answer that question. I'll try to give you the short, the compact version here, because I think there's also some misconceptions about why and when things happen. So what I was telling you before, what zoning is, that all sounds very cut and dry, right? It's usually framed in terms of these vague, semi-scientific justifications that don't often tell you about the motives behind them, right? They seem inoffensive enough in the surface. But the motives are more complex. I would start by saying, though, that you often hear it said, you probably heard it said, right, that zoning was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, to polluting factories and People didn't want homes built next to, factories emitting, toxic fumes and whatnot. But that's not really borne out by the history, right? The Industrial Revolution in the United States began the first half of the 19th century. It was already well into its second phase by the late 1800s, but zoning, as we know it, really didn't start spreading nationwide in the United States until the 1920s. So polluting factories, railroads had been around for almost a century before that. So that's part of it, but I don't think that's the real explanation. So to answer your question, so why did it? Why did it arise, right? I think at least I would propose two main answers. It's an author, Seymour Toll, who wrote a book, Zoned American, back in the late 60s. His observation was that, quote, the immigrant is in the fiber of zoning, by which he referred to international immigrants and perceived zoning regulations as being an attempt to exclude them, whether that was Chinese laundromats out on the West Coast or European garment workers in Manhattan. But I think another part of that is not just international immigration, but domestic population movements. Especially the Great Migration of Black Americans in the early 20th century. There's a scholar named Tom Cooey, who has a recent paper linking some changes in zoning to the timeline of the Great Migration. And this being a reaction, particularly by northern cities to an influx of Black Americans. Whether it's a direct reaction, it's hard to know. There certainly was a consequential Supreme Court decision in 1917. It's the Worley versus Buchanan case, which outlawed zoning on the basis of race, which had formerly been used. And I think at that point, there were some cities probably looking for legal alternatives to that system of explicit racial zoning, which they had before. In 1917, that's pretty close to when you start to see modern zoning start to arise. So the other factor I think you can't ignore is the rise of the automobile. So in the 1920s, you start seeing an explosion in car ownership. Yet the Model T is introduced, and after the war, cost starts to come down, and a lot of Americans are actually able to afford their own car. It's unprecedented. What that does for the streets is it means the streets, which had for centuries moved at the pace of a horse's trot, suddenly become places where, with a second's inattention, it could cost you your life or at least a severe injury. Peter Norton's book, Fighting Traffic, details this time period and how people were terrified of the human toll, particularly on children, that was being caused by high-speed automobiles. And people were wondering how they were going to deal with this menace. And it was very convenient, but it was resulting in a horrific human cost. So one reaction was, excluding retail establishments, which became perceived as nuisances because everybody was driving to them, right? They attracted cars, which are noisy, smelly, and dangerous. Similarly, as people in apartments began to afford cars, people began to look at the apartments as nuisances because everybody was parking their cars and clustering around the apartment building. And that was dangerous. So the single-family home on a large lot was a way of protecting against the menace of the car while still allowing people to own one. I think that can't be ignored either. If you look at many of the cases and discussions around that time, you see that as an issue. People are trying to figure out how to accommodate the car. And after this campaign to put speed governors on cars and limit them to about 25 miles an hour, which was attempted in Cincinnati, after those attempts failed, essentially people throw up their hands and say, these cars are going to be whizzing around at high speeds. We just have to go into defensive mode and protect ourselves against them. Zoning was one way of addressing that. That's not an exclusive list, but I think those are two of the main two of the main threads: a transportation-based thread and the demographic a reaction to the Great Migration, international immigration, and also the Supreme Court decision that I mentioned to you.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So when we think about essentially the intentions of zoning, we're hearing that like we're trying to regulate the movement of people, the living areas of people, and also essentially the movement of vehicles, which was a brand new invention, so which is kind of an exciting thing. But it's interesting to think about how with vehicles it was safety focused. Would you say that the intention was similar with regulating sort of human movement, or how would you kind of help us, like, let's dig in a little bit, like how are we thinking about the concerns that folks had around the Great Migration or the immigration of different peoples?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were prejudices involved at that time, whether it was racial prejudices or national origin prejudices. This coincided with the early 1920s with the immigration restrictionist movement. So there were, and some other domestic movements, right, where these issues were getting attention. And, these are not, as the Supreme Court did note in 1917, these are not proper subjects. One's own biases and bigotry are not proper biases for municipal ordinances. So what some of zoning tries to do is to sort of use what seem to be even-handed regulations to enact economic segregation in a way that's expected or perhaps hoped to follow other demographic lines, whether it's intended to promote racial segregation or segregation of the foreign-born population, or whoever is perceived as having limited economic opportunities. So it both, creates those disparate opportunities and reinforces those lack of opportunities by creating sort of a geographic separation, and what that means in terms of being able to access a labor market or have easy transportation to the necessities of daily life or access certain schools. These are all things that play into it. But, ultimately, I think a lot of it probably does stem from those prejudices, some of which were simply economic and some of which were, reflect the racial issues at the time.
Well, it's interesting. So my understanding is that actually zoning was sort of this indirect way to perpetuate segregation and racism, right? So you have the New Deal, which is in the 1920s, and kind of that is when segregation and discrimination are being actively written into law, saying that homes are devalued if they're in predominantly white communities. Non-white communities. If they have more apartment buildings, they're being devalued, and just really prioritizing low density segregated spaces, really written into the law, what we call redlining today, where they would outline those communities in red that were predominantly Black, tended to have things like factories, like you said, like those things were often being pushed together. And so it's, but essentially lack of green space, those are all redlined. And then you have the green lined and the yellow spaces. Yellow would be like the integrated spaces, et cetera. Green being predominantly white. But my understanding is that actually it was in the 1950s when the law could no longer be explicitly racist, that zoning was created as sort of a roundabout way to have the same impact. Am I misunderstanding that? Am I misunderstanding the timeline of that?
No, not at all. The decision I mentioned from 1917, that only pertained to actual laws, public laws passed by a city or a town. So After that happened, you could still have a private covenant that was exclusive, that excluded people of certain incomes or excluded people of certain races or excluded people of certain ethnicities. That was still lawful, right? Because it wasn't considered government action. So that technically remained legal up until 1948. There was another case called Shelley versus Kramer. And that held that restrictive covenants, which say, for example, I think the example in the case was restrictive covenant, which prohibited the sale of a house to somebody who wasn't Caucasian, which is the subject, could not be enforced by a court. So you could still write it into the deed, but if somebody violated it and, sold their home to somebody of a different race or a different background, the court wasn't going to intervene and nullify the sale. So that really, I think that kicks off a second chapter, because then you lose the private ability to enforce these exclusions, which you still did have even after that Buchanan decision but it became difficult, particularly for existing neighborhoods. It can be hard to coordinate a whole restrictive covenant among, 50, 100 different owners and get them all to agree to terms. A lot of people are going to say, no, I don't want that sort of restriction on their property. I want to be able to sell to whoever I want. You can't count on everybody having the same, right, the same prejudices that you have. Some people may feel very differently. But it still was possible to do through 1948. And after that, you do start to see a new wave of restrictive zoning, sort of an intensification that takes place around that time.
Yeah, and I would say that, here, even in Minneapolis, a northern city, between 1920 and 1948, the 1950s, communities really rallied around that segregation and those racial covenants to uphold them and say, like, yep. And there's a lot of state sanctioned violence as a result of those covenants, and people's general sense that if we allow non-white folks into our communities, we will lose value on our properties, and our communities won't be as safe, and our children's education will decline, and all these pieces. And we know that the real estate industry actually had a lot to do with this kind of messaging, really playing at people's fears, to get them to raise the value of their home or sell quickly or things like that.
That's exactly right. Even as late as the 1940s in New York on Long Island, there were still racial covenants that were placed on some of the new subdivisions out there, even when the builders necessarily didn't share those prejudices, but they said, well, I may not agree with it, but that's the market demand, and I need to, it helps, increases my ability to sell the homes to have those covenants on them. Those, hopefully, optimistically, you would think that those might have disappeared with time anyways. But 1948, it was cut off just by judicial action. What you did start to see after, right around that time, started a little bit before, but particularly after that time, is you start to see an intensification of what single-family zoning is. It used to be, you might only be able to build one unit, but it was still pretty flexible about how much land you needed and where you could build it and how big you could build it. You started to see new restrictions, for example, saying that, for example, here in Connecticut, you would need an acre or 2 acres of land to build a single house. Think about it, it seems crazy, even in an area where you have city services. So you have to buy all that land just to build a house. You're going to put it out of the reach of somebody of a modest income. Or you can't put a mobile home on your house. You can only build it in a special mobile home zone. There you go. A whole category of cheaper homes eliminated. Also, minimum home size. Say, sure, you can build a house on a smaller piece of land, but it has to be at least 1,500 square feet or 2,000 square feet. Which was had been a practice in restrictive covenants going back a long time, but began to be put in zoning codes. So all of those things start to arise. And if you look at it, you kind of squint a little bit and look at some of the zoning maps, they start to look quite a lot like restrictive covenants with the way that they vary in terms of some of these regulations. I don't think you have to contort them too much to see that they're substituting is in some ways for those covenants. But those elements really do take off. Is what I found in a recent research project I've been doing right around that time frame. And you could say maybe it was just coincidental, but which in historical terms maybe that's the best you're going to do. But there were other factors going on as well, right? You had the baby boom. There were major population movements into the suburbs. People were afraid of population growth. It wasn't just that, but the timing is a little suspect. So
that's right. I appreciate that. So I'm just gonna give our folks a little bit of data to kind of for awareness of what is happening in Minneapolis, because ultimately that is what our focus is our work here in the Twin Cities. And so as we're talking about like this history, like what is going on today, in 2019, there was a study done by the Star Tribune that set 73% of residential land was governed by local zoning that only allowed for single family, explicitly detached homes. More than 65% of the land across the state of Minnesota is regulated for only single family homes, requires a minimum lot size. And this gets to exactly what you're speaking to, Charles, of 1/4 acre or more, and at least twice the size of a typical home in Minneapolis. So as you get outside of the city, the plot of land that's required for a single family home actually gets larger. And obviously there's economic implications to that, because who has the capital to buy larger plots of land? Given all the history that we've talked about on this podcast, we know that typically African-American people, immigrant people, indigenous people did not have access to that kind of capital. And so kind of bringing us into this piece today, we know that 10% of residential land in the Twin Cities allows for modest cost housing, which is duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes. What is well known in the development industry is the missing middle housing. 7% of residential land in Minnesota is slated for specifically apartment buildings. And this is kind of, even though our data is specific to Minnesota, this trend follows in a lot of states across the U.S. So, Charles, I'd love for you to kind of break down why that matters for folks. So, how did this initial zoning regulation pattern really impact how we see our cities laid out today, and like really who our neighbors are, right? Like, how did it really kind of determine what life is like today?
Yeah, thank you for quoting those stats. I just want to mention you may be aware the Zoning Atlas project, which is at least completed in Connecticut, and there's a few other states where it's in progress, which is trying to break down the overall zoning, not just city by city, but for a whole state. And where you see some of those common threads, for example, in Connecticut, something like over 90% of the land, the residential land is zoned for single family. So I think you see a lot of which is large lot, single family. So I think
over 90%.
I think it's something like 91%, something very close to that of all the residential land, most of which is for large lot houses, which would be obviously more expensive for somebody to acquire. And I don't think that's atypical for a state. At least certainly even in if you look at us, like you said, in a city zoning map in Minneapolis, or whether it's or Austin, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee, or wherever it might be, you tend to see large areas of the city devoted to single family zoning, even within a major prosperous metro area with high demand for housing.
That's right.
But to your question, I mean, I think it's always helpful, for anybody listening here in particular, just to bring up a zoning map, even maybe the one for the town that you live in, and see how that actually affects where things are in your town, who your neighbors are, what's close to you, what can be built in your town. Typically, if you bring it up, it'll look something like a modern artwork, right? Something you see at the Museum of Modern Art, this patchwork of colors and cross-hatching and crazy lines and everything going every which ways. Even the simplest one is going to be a little difficult to parse. And some of the ones with multiple overlays, it's hard to make heads or tails of it. It's so complex in terms of the degree of regulation. So, typically it can affect, anything from whether you have any businesses near you, whether you have a coffee shop you can walk to, whether, the economic, as you mentioned, the economic status of your neighbors. It might set a baseline for the costs of the housing around. Predicting what kind of neighbors you're likely to have, which is often the intent of the zoning regulation, right? It's uniform and sets a baseline. So typically what the zones do, though, is lock in place what already exists in the way that a covenant does. It simply doesn't allow for change. And in order to even change the regulations, much less change what's there, can require a lot of political effort.
That's right.
But otherwise, it's just keeping in place what's already there, assuring people that there isn't going to be any sort of dramatic change other than maybe your neighbor, redoing their kitchen or adding a porch or something like that. And that you can be assured of that, no matter what the demands are in your town, no matter how many people want to live there, no matter what kind of businesses might want to open. It's going to prevent that and make change slow and gradual. That's the predominant effect.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think how I think about that in short, sort of like summary, is that the disparities that are built in today, zoning really cements them in a lot of ways. To your point, it makes it really difficult to change these segregationist, racist practices, as well as their impacts. And just to be clear with folks, like, zoning doesn't explicitly name race, as we talked about, but because it follows the same pattern as redlining, which was all about race, it has the same impact. And it is, a lot of researchers say that is one of the major reasons why the Twin Cities has like some of the worst housing disparities around income and wealth, is because of our movement specifically from racial covenants into the zoning that we have to really prioritize predominantly white neighborhoods. But ultimately, like, we know that like our neighbors, like who our neighbors are, is going to be impacted by this, right? Like, so if we know that African-American community has less access to single family home capital, but has more access to, say, a multi-unit condominium structure, or is a larger percentage of renters in a community, that dynamic of actually desegregating your community and ensuring that your children are going to school with people that don't look like them, because that is the world that we live in, is much harder to happen under zoning. And so that's how I think of the impact on people's lives. I think that given what's going on today locally around the 2040 plan, I'd love to just talk a little bit about that a bit more. So as I mentioned earlier, the 2040 plan really is seeking to address a lot of these issues to help create a more equitable Minneapolis. From your perspective, Charles, like, how does the pause on that plan, that current pause, like, how does that impact things like construction and development, for example?
Yeah. Well, the decision itself is interesting, and the politics around that are another subject to discuss. But as far as the construction, I would say it's a little hard to know because I think the city estimated there was going to be something like 43,000 new units built as a result of the plan, but not going all the way through 2040, right? And I think the figure I saw that the total capacity increase of the change was 150,000, right? After the 2040 plan went into effect, you could build 150,000 more units as compared to the 2030 plan. So they were only estimating that over the next 2 decades or so, 15, 20 years, only about a third of that was going to be built. And it's hard to know because so many factors go into it. It's not just overall demand, the state of the economy, the rate of population growth, but also financing, right? What the interest rates are, the opportunity cost of replacing existing building. It can be very difficult to know. We do know that I think the plan was in effect for a little while before the court order. If I'm not, do I have that understanding correct?
That is correct. That folks were kind of proceeding as if it was in effect, and then we all had to readjust.
Right. In midstream, it's just incredible to me. Which again, I think shows that there's a whole sort of a legal side, the courtroom side of things here, which is a big piece, can be a benefit, but can also be a huge obstacle to making progress, right? We talked about some of the interventions that courts have had in the past in order to strike down things, but they can also intervene the opposite way, right, and obstruct democratic change. So I guess we do know that the small multifamily starts did increase a bit after the plan came into effect. I think there were something like 62 duplexes and 17 triplexes approved between 2020 and March 2022, which was up from before, but is not in the context of the whole city of Minneapolis, right? It's not a huge number, which may have to do with the limitations on the amount of floor area you can build, which is something that could be changed, right? It's just the fact of overturning or getting rid of single family zoning, or at least permitting, allowing people to build more than one unit inside a building. This is another way to phrase it, right? It's not so scary, right? You have two stoves in a building instead of one, right? I mean, however you want to put it. That is a big achievement in and of itself, and you can't necessarily expect to do everything all at once. At some points, you have to sit back, see what the effect is, and then follow up, which is what you've seen in a lot of states. Change has been incremental, and that's something that Minneapolis has done too. And so I was looking at some of the numbers here, and housing permits, building permits were way up in Minneapolis even before the 2040 plan went into effect. So, and again, I don't know if it's cause or effect, but parking minimums were reduced in 2015. That probably had an effect. And now, as far as I know, despite the court's order, they're gonzo. They're out the window. So, other changes like that can also, without being major planning overhauls, comprehensive plans can have effects too. And it seems like that's had an effect on increasing multifamily construction. And a large majority of the construction now in the city of Minneapolis is in multifamily housing, in part due to that. And parking is until fairly recently, until a few scholars brought attention to it, was just seen as par for the course. But it's such an added cost, particularly with multifamily, where you need to build structured parking or underground parking in terms of the cost it adds to a unit. And quickly it becomes very difficult to build multifamily for people of modest incomes. You get rid of those requirements, and the costs can really come down. You're going to need a transportation plan and all that, and all the other things that cities are supposed to be doing to take care of their citizens and ensure their mobility. Yeah, but that's huge too, and that wasn't affected. Seems like that's had an effect also. So
Yeah, those are
I mean, it's
points.
yeah. I'm sorry I was sorry to see that decision, but there's also activity. I think just the other day there was a hearing on a bill to exempt comprehensive plans from Minnesota's state environmental law, which would address the issue at the core of this. So, hopefully there's some sort of resolution.
Right. And I think that has been before the legislature recently.
Just a couple days ago, because it was in committee, but that's, another way the legislature can act and say, well, we created this right, and the legislature can also step in and modify it. The role of state governments in bringing about land use and zoning change is really taken off over the last couple of years. And, Minnesota's Minnesota's no different. They're aware of these issues, and Minnesota cities can't do comprehensive planning without going to the ends of the earth on some incredibly detailed environmental analysis. That's just going to freeze the whole process of comprehensive planning. Just is not beneficial to anyone. So,
right,
it'll be interesting to see what happens.
No, absolutely. And I think, again, getting back to sort of like the focus for today, just really around the racial wealth gap and the impact of zoning on that. When, we sort of stand in these current restrictions, any just like thoughts on how that impacts the overall movement towards closing the racial wealth gap?
I think the closing off neighborhoods, and in some cases entire towns, on the basis of income does also close people off from participating fully in the economy in a way that's not just about housing wealth, which is, somewhat a volatile thing, right? We're just over the last 20 years, we've seen prices surge, we've seen prices crash, and then since COVID, we've seen, despite interest rates, we've seen prices go through the roof again. But the ability to form networks and connections with different people from different backgrounds, ability to attend the school of your choice, all the sorts of things, all the sorts of life choices that go into, somebody's economic opportunities are ultimately affected by choice of residence, and that in turn is affected by, the entry point to get into a particular town or a particular neighborhood or a particular school district. And all too often you see this even goes beyond the issue of race to sort of an extraordinarily finely grained economic segregation where resources are, the greatest resources are expended on a small area with a relatively small number of children, since most families say can't afford to live there. Whereas, fewer resources are devoted to a much larger district because of whatever geographic segregation or towns keeping property taxes to themselves. This gets into a whole governance issue. So I think those are the major effects. It's not just the fact of owning a house. It's the whole spread of opportunities over the course of somebody's childhood and lifetime that go into their career, their education, their career.
That's right. That's right. And I 100% agree, and also recognize that the wealth gap is something that sort of looms large, and we're actively working toward closing it. And just to give folks a little bit of context, right? If we think about Black families not having access to high value communities, any homes that we buy are simply worth less, which means that they contribute less to our retirement or less to the next generation. And that has that long-term impact that we know all too well, that continues to actually widen the gap. If, as we sort of kind of wind down the conversation, I'd love to get your perspective on what do you feel like are the greatest impacts to zoning specifically? Like, if we were going to come in and magically just change zoning today, which we know requires a whole legal process, so we can't do that, but we're going to dream. What should those changes look like, and how long, given the actuality of the process, how long would it take to see those changes in effect?
So this is sort of the magic wand question, right? If I could just wave the wand and make one change just immediately to the code or anything like that. That is a good question. I've heard that one asked before, and that's really tough. Like, there's so many different things you could do, so many levers and knobs that could be changed. I mean, for me, this is just me personally. I'm not going to say that would be the most effective intervention. The one that bothers me the most is exorbitant minimum lot sizes that make it impossible to divide up existing lots where there's a lot of demand for living, and where the infrastructure often already exists. Because you can say, I mean, at least you can say, well, apartments tend to be more affordable and single-family homes. Well, I mean, sometimes, right? High-rise apartments can actually be very expensive. They're costly to build. Some low-rise rental apartments can be inexpensive, but there's no particular reason a single-family house has to be incredibly expensive. Most Americans, for most American history, live in very modest single-family homes, and still do today. Whether those are mobile homes or just very small single-family homes. If you're going to build one of those, which I would say the typical mobile home is in the reach of most Americans. There's millions of Americans who live in them. You're going to need a smaller piece of land to make it affordable. So that would have a major change. And I think we know it would, because we have a couple examples in America where that has happened, and where there has been a fairly sudden reaction by developers, such as in Houston, where the old minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet, even right near the downtown, which is pretty typical for American cities. It's not a big lot. If you saw, 5,000 square foot vacant piece of land, it's not a ton of space, but the average house is only about 2,000 square feet, 2 stories, so it's still easily fit a home. And they cut that by a third to 1,400 square feet, and there has been an incredible boom in redevelopment of housing of all types, from small homes that are very expensive to some which are quite reasonable considering where they're located. Because I think, talking about preferences, people say, well, all Americans want to live in a single family home, or nobody wants to live in an apartment. Regardless of whether or not that's true, I think the goal at least should be for maximizing freedom of choice and opportunities for people. And if you would like to have a single family home on its own lot, the law shouldn't be impeding you from doing that, even if it's a very modest home on a very small lot. It's a place to call your own it outright, be simple, it's yours. And that's a change that could promote wider home ownership and wider opportunities for people.
Great.
Particularly prevalent, like I said, since the 1950s. Like I said, the parking minimums, multifamily housing, that's all wonderful too. That's all part of the picture. And we could get into some governance issues as well, and how communities are organized. That would be, I don't know, that would be too big a magic spell, I think, I would need a few wands for that, right? To talk about regionalization and consolidation and annexation and all that, which I think plays into it too and affects the incentives. But just to your question, I'm picking up a somewhat more narrow issues. So,
no, I appreciate that. And for folks understanding kind of how long these processes happen, if you were to go back to like the normal protocols for getting zoning changed, having that initiative pass, how long would it take for neighborhoods to actually shift in reflection of that change?
I mean, if it's a place where there's a lot of demand, I think you could see change happening potentially right away if housing is dramatically undersupplied, or if it's an area close to a city center where zoning hasn't caught up to demand. But it's also important for the affordability of new housing developments elsewhere, even out in the suburbs, in terms of suburban development where land costs are lower. So, and that's where smaller lot sizes or more modest houses are typically there's the most anxiety about them, because land can be had for a lower cost. And if you split it up a few different ways, well, suddenly it becomes affordable to a lot more people. So that has been, fiercely resisted in a lot of, particularly more suburban jurisdictions. So I think to answer you, it's fairly quick, particularly since, building a single family house is just procedurally a lot simpler in America than getting entitled to build a multifamily structure. Often, right, the codes are more difficult, the financing is more difficult. But for a single family detached home, financing is pretty straightforward, the permitting is pretty straightforward, the building code's pretty lenient. It doesn't take as much time to get up to speed. So that's another thing in its favor, right? You don't have to line up a whole bunch of funding or do site consolidation. So it's a little nimbler.
Absolutely. Anything that can be done to repair the harm that restrictive zoning has caused in neighborhoods?
Well, I think it is it has been and will continue to be a gradual process of cities and states pushing reforms, and also people changing the conversation around housing in order to help some of these reforms happen. It's generally called, right, the YIMBY movement, the pro-housing movement, which has a whole lot of facets to it, but changing a whole discussion around housing production, around economic growth, and what that means, and knocking down some of the misconceptions that there are around that, because it's a topic that about which at least certain people feel very strongly. I think there's a large number of people for whom it's not a particularly interesting topic. I mean, not many people go to down to the city hall and browse through the zoning code on their free time, right? It's just It's not thrilling reading. It's probably like 300 pages, and you're not going to pick it up for summer reading or whatever. So I have to concede that there's a particular group of people that's interested. But within that, publicizing these reform efforts, winning over people by presenting the facts, a lot of what we've discussed here today, the actual numbers, destigmatizing a lot of this stuff, talking in terms the way that people from all sorts of backgrounds, including political backgrounds, can talk about whether it's equity or property rights. All these things, I think, play into the big picture and getting things done to, like you said, undo some of this damage. And I'm encouraged. Just this past year, just in 2023, and it's already been picking up this year as well. There's been a lot of activity in state houses across the country on the zoning reform front, whether it's accessory dwelling units or transit-oriented development or parking changes or all sorts of reforms, procedural streamlining that have that are correcting some of the issues that are still with us today. So long-winded answer to that, but I think it's, unfortunately, it isn't going to be a magic wand. It's going to be a gradual process. The zoning edifice wasn't built in a day, right? It was built up over many decades, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and you try to do it all at once, right? And you end up litigating it or whatever. So it's got to be something for the long haul. I would like to see a real change in the conversation about some of these basics about who the community is for, who the community is supposed to serve, and what that means in terms of an actual coherent housing policy. So, I would love to see things change in a way so that, we have an actual walkable town center where people can get around on foot, or kids can walk to school safely, where there are, in fact, some more affordable multifamily opportunities or smaller single-family houses. Just overall making a more diverse, physically and form-wise community. So, however that's going to play out, it's a bit of an uphill battle. But I know there are other people who feel that way, who, sometimes they feel like they're in the minority, but then sometimes when you talk to people privately and say, you know what, I agree with you. It's like, housing is too expensive here. It's like, my kids aren't going to be able to afford to live here. All these things, they're sympathetic to it and they understand the issues. So, you've got to keep things right. Keep that dream positive. It's not like we're trying to stick it to you guys with low income housing. Right? It's the framework, the framing that's typically given. Like, that's not what it's about at all. It's not an attack. It's about rethinking what our priorities of our town are and our community are, and what the future is going to look like. So, a tough conversation to have, but I think it's important to have. In Minnesota, I think the comp plans mean a little bit more than they do, right? You actually have to stick to them. We don't quite have that here, so maybe that would be an improvement.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I really appreciate that, Charles. I appreciate the vision that you have for your own community, and also the work that you do on a national level to help us all understand this issue, this, like you said, this complicated, very fascinating topic.
So.
Right. That so many people are just running to go read about. But it is happening. It's an active topic. It's in our legislation right now. It's an active conversation. And so hopefully more folks will get involved. For those of you listening, this is the close of our podcast. Charles, again, thank you so much for being our guest today, and lending your expertise to our followers here at Urban Homeworks. If you're not already following us on social media, please do so. We are at Urban Homeworks across all of the platforms, which include Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where you will be able to watch this podcast, as well as listen to it on Spotify. Before we close out, is there anything that you want to share with the audience? Anything you want them to keep their eyes on? Anything exciting that you're like, we're working on this, follow it, track it?
Well, yeah, no, I would like to, well, just plug the work we do in the Urbanity team in general. If anybody is interested in these issues, particularly really diving into the nitty-gritty details of how reforms are playing out on housing supply and demand issues. All of that research, everything we published is available on the Mercatus Center website. My colleagues there, Salim Firth and Emily Hamilton, have authored a lot of interesting paper along with other scholars there on housing issues. And they're both on Twitter as well, where they promote their work. And you can follow me there too, for positive feedback, negative feedback, whatever you want. I'm an old urbanist. So if it's of any interest to people, I would suggest that you check out some of our work. And we're always turning out new stuff, especially this time of year, a lot of work on the legislative side. If you're curious about following what's going on in various states, we have good resources on that sort of bring together what the trends are.
That's great. I know we have nerdy listeners out there. So please check our show notes, y'all. We'll have all those links that Charles mentioned in those notes. I just want to name that a lot of research was done to prepare for this interview. So again, we cite everything in our show notes. So please use that as a reference. And much gratitude to our marketing and communication manager, Katie Herrick, for all that she does behind the scenes to make these podcasts go well, and to be worth your listen as an audience. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for tuning in to Reclaiming Home, Housing Justice with Urban Homeworks for today's discussion. If you like this podcast and want to support Urban Homeworks housing work, head over to www.urbanhomeworks.org/donate to make a gift, attend a future event, volunteer with us, or learn more. Until next time, remain connected and informed.